like to talk a little bit today in the history video about the history of the United Nations. It was formed, as you know, as an outgrowth of World War II, and originally was conceptualized as in the Atlantic Charter that was signed by President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill on a battleship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean shortly after the United States entered the war. And the concept of the United Nations originally was as a service organization where countries that are on the brink of war or fighting a war could meet, adjudicate their differences in peace, and come to a peace agreement. And the administrative function of the UN was to police that agreement, to enforce it, to make sure that nobody broke the deal, and send monitors to observe the ceasefires and stuff like that. And beyond that, there was some humanitarian service stuff about UNESCO and UNICEF and stuff like that. But now the United Nations has evolved to a point where the liberal elites that run it want it to be a global government. They want it to become the seat of a one-world government. Now, the one-world government started to be prominent in the early 1960s when David Rockefeller and a guy named Maurice Strong, who currently lives in Beijing, an American, set up the Club of Rome, and they invited 100 of the top leaders in the world, usually former leaders, to join this club. And the club currently has Pierre Trudeau, former Prime Minister of Canada, Giscard d'Estaing, the former President of France, Jimmy Carter, Al Gore, and a collection, Gorbachev, and a collection of other luminaries in it. And the concept is to push for global governance. The way that they originally were going to do this, and by the way, this stuff is all from Here Comes the Black Helicopters, Eileen's in my new book, was through population control. Back in the 60s and the 70s, they sold the world on the notion that we were going to become so overcrowded, the old Malthusian theory, that food production would fall, population would grow, and we'd all starve to death. And they insisted that there be a global government to enforce population control throughout the world. Part of that was legalizing abortion. Part of that was the one-child policy in China, and all kinds of efforts of that sort. Now, of course, that turned out to be a total fraud. The world population will, in fact, be decreasing. It's now close to 7 billion. It's going to rise to 8 billion by 2050, and then it's going to drop. And the big problem we're going to face is a labor shortage, not overpopulation. And obviously the food production has more than kept pace with the population growth. So after the 70s, as we move into the late 70s and the 80s, they turned to climate and global warming as the excuse for global government. We needed one government to make sure that we could preserve the planet, make sure that third world countries wouldn't decimate the rainforest, make sure that first world countries would limit their carbon emissions. And if we didn't do this, the planet was going to die. And therefore it was necessary to cede sovereignty and cede power to the experts and bureaucrats at the United Nations so that we could avert climate disaster and our planet would survive. That was the new deal and the new effort for global governance. Now, this history, again, hasn't borne out the predictions of a disaster. There were two parts to the critique of climate change. One was that the temperatures would rise and those temperatures would cause a rise in sea level. And that's happened. But it's not drastic. It's a couple of inches or a couple of centimeters over the course of the next 4 or 5 decades. It's not a very serious thing. But the other thought was that their computer models predicted that if that happened, that would then warm the oceans, and the oceans would then release carbon dioxide, which would increase the global warming 3 or 4 times more than the simple increase in atmospheric temperature. You take a can of Coca-Cola, you open it. If you leave it in the refrigerator, it stays bubbly. If you put it outside, it goes flat very quickly. That's because warmth increases carbon emissions, and the ocean would release its carbon and cause dramatic climate change 3 times more than the simple increase in atmospheric temperatures. That hasn't happened. We've had 30 years of studying that, and there is no evidence that that's going on. So once again, the whole global community tried to get everybody all exercised about the need for fundamental change in global policies over something that didn't exist. The biggest of these was Agenda 21, which is a series of land use regulations proposed by the United Nations, now adopted by almost 2,000 municipalities in the United States, to increase population density, move people away from suburbs, move them away from open spaces, away from rural areas, off the farm, into dense urban situations where they don't have to drive cars and they can walk and they can bike. And that really is the goal of the planners. Obama is already moving toward tax incentives to encourage people to move into the cities. Reminds us a little bit of Stalin's efforts to get people off the farms and into the cities by collectivization to create a labor force for the Soviet Union. Well, all of these plans all rest on a fundamental assumption, which is against democracy, a view that the elites know better. The people that run the United Nations, the scientists, the economists, the experts, know better than democratically elected regimes. And the United Nations has gone from being a service organization to a would-be and wanna-be global government. That's one of the key things we talk about, and here come the black helicopters, and I urge you to get a copy of it, because this stuff is terribly important and terribly topical. Thanks a lot for watching.